Hello and welcome to Dragon Bites, the paediatric podcast aimed at paediatric trainees or anyone interested in child health. I'm Dr. Stacey Harris, one of the founders of Dragon Bites, and today we have one of our career pods, and we're joined by Dr. Lizzie Nickerson, who's a consultant in community paediatrics, Emily Shand, who is a community grid trainee, and Siwan Lloyd, who's also a community grid trainee. And they're going to take us through how to do your best in the community grid interview.
So I think I did quite a lot of trying to read up before the interview. So trying to read.
How can trainees get ready
the
for the interview?
And any relevant, as I was saying, I signed up for the batch newsletters, trying to read through the newsletters. I also tried to read through some relevant journals to try and get an idea of the new research that was going on in the field to sort of psychologically prepare myself, I guess, for the interview. I also then tried to email consultants that I knew or other community trainees to ask if they think of anything relevant that I should be reading or that I should be aware of, any new topics coming up in the field. I then tried to sort of sit down and think of lots of examples of sort of momentous occasions, I guess, in my training or any patient interactions that have been very valuable and that I've learned a lot from. And kind of tried to write them all down, lots of things that have helped me in my sort of career development to help so that I could use those to help structure answers to questions about my experiences so that I had them all fresh in my mind. For our interview, we had to do a presentation. So quite a lot of my interview prep time went into preparing a presentation and then trying to make sure that I ran through that a few times to make sure that I was sticking to the time limits that they had. In the community interview, we had the topic for the presentation in advance. So that was very helpful. For the neurodisability interview, I did not have the topic in advance, so I was given the topic on the day. So that was quite stressful. So for that one, I just tried to think of what sorts of things they might ask us to present and tried to sort of practice making a presentation quickly in a very short period of time that was structured, and then tried to run through that just to get an idea of how long 5 or 10 minutes is, because we're not often sort of having to do presentations that are very time bound. I guess I also tried to think about what I wanted the interview panel to know. So I tried to think about, any achievements that I'd had, to try and think if they asked me about my achievements or about what I've done, what do I want them to know? Is there any projects I'm particularly proud of, or any taster weeks or experiences where I've learned a lot that I want them to know about? So I tried to make a list of things to keep fresh in my mind. And then I guess my main thing, as we said previously about you have to sell yourself on the application form, is that you really have to sell yourself in the interview, and that's something that I think we would all say doesn't come naturally. And one of my main feedback, so I had a question in one of my interviews about my motivation to pursue this career, and I answered the question by talking about how much I enjoy working in this field and what interests me. But I didn't realise until afterwards, when the interview feedback came back, that they actually expected me to talk about my personal attributes and strengths that made me suitable to this career. They wanted me to talk about academic things, leadership, teaching skills, and the actual quote on my feedback form was that this was an opportunity to go through your CV and tell us why you are suitable for this job, which I sort of totally missed and didn't realise, and I thought they were just asking me to tell them why I wanted to do it. And so I was quite surprised by that, because I think it doesn't come naturally for us to be asked a question and then to immediately answer it by telling somebody about everything we've done and all our achievements. So I think practicing that as well. If I did my interviews again, I think maybe sitting down with somebody and practicing how to sell yourself in a way, and how to answer questions in a way that really gets across everything that you've done and all of your strengths. Because as Lizzie said previously, that the people on the panel, they don't know you. They don't know if you're a good trainee or a terrible trainee, and so you really have to tell them. So that's something I think that takes a lot of practice to get used to, being able to have that self-confidence to answer questions in that way. I wish I could do my interviews again now. Yeah.
That's absolutely
Well,
amazing advice,
actually, no,
Siwan.
I don't want to do the interview.
Thank you. No, you don't need to because you got in, didn't you?
So
You.
similar to preparing my
It wasn't that
application,
bad. Emily, what did you do to get ready for your interview?
For any grid application. So I didn't only ask community trainees, but what sort of things do people ask? And I had a couple of friends and colleagues who've recently done consultant interviews. So I actually also asked them, what sort of questions were you asked? And I've kind of made a list of key areas that people were asked about, and then I thought about what I would say and how I would answer that. As Siwan said, think about what I want the interview panel to know. And I was told by somebody to assume that your interview panel haven't read your application form, and go in being prepared to sell yourself again. So that was quite helpful. So I also made a list of things, projects that I wanted to mention, or possible cases that I'd seen that I thought showed some of my personal attributes that I wanted the panel to hear. I didn't necessarily get to talk about all of them, but I felt well prepared. I'd have an example for a time when I was an advocate for a patient, or where I showed integrity, or could give an example of something that had transferable skills, those sorts of things. I also found it quite helpful to go back through my e-portfolio and look at some of the reflections that I've done over the years. Now, I've been a paediatric trainee for a number of years, and so there are quite a lot of reflections on there. And some of those cases I have pretty much forgotten about. So when I read them back, it was quite useful to see what I'd written and then think about it from a how can I use this to sell myself kind of perspective. So an example was a child that I saw as a neonatal registrar who had a complex condition, and I needed to involve lots of different teams, and also involve the family in decision making. And so there were loads of different things that I could pull out of that one example that would answer a whole string of different questions. And so I probably thought about sort of 3 or 4 cases that I thought I could use for a number of different questions. So that was quite helpful. And then the only other thing is practice. So I tried practicing with my husband, but I just laughed. I couldn't do it. So I asked a couple of consultants who I was a little bit frightened of, but also quite happy to talk to, just to put myself under a little bit of pressure, but equally get something out of it, and practice performing, I suppose. So yeah, those were my thoughts, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reinforcing a lot of
Sounds
what,
like great
what
preparation.
Emily and Siwan
Thank you,
have said
Emily.
already.
Lizzie, did you have any
but basically,
other ways
practice.
trainees could get
So
ready for the interview?
when I applied for it, as I mentioned, I was the first year, so I didn't. There weren't any previous community trainees who'd been through the grid application for me to practice with. So I actually practiced with somebody who did neonatal grid, and it made no difference at all, because it's all transferable across the grids. It's about your style, it's about how you present yourself, and it's about what we've said, being comfortable with selling yourself, and I think at the end of the day, if you don't say it, they don't know it. As Siwan said, you have to assume that they haven't read your application, or I think it might be Emily said, you have to assume that they haven't read your application form. So, and the only person you'll be kicking afterwards if you didn't say it is yourself, because you can only blame yourself if they don't know something. So it's better to say things especially things that you're very proud of, several times, to make sure that you get your point across. It's a bit like being a politician, really, you know, going in with your sales pitch and keeping to that. So I think having a handful of achievements that you are really proud of, and that you know that you do not want to walk out the door of that interview panel until you have told them about that, are really important, because otherwise you'll walk out and think, oh, I didn't mention, you know, that brilliant research project I did, or whatever it was. And as Emily said, having a handful of complex cases, really, that you can adapt to any question that you get asked that's case related, is a really good thing. So always a safeguarding question will come up. So always have a good safeguarding case to discuss. And yeah, I think those would probably be my top tips. Unlike me, during this podcast, don't waffle. It's important to sort of, when you get asked the question, bullet point what the points are you're going to talk about, then talk about those points, and then bullet point them again at the end. So you're essentially making the interviewer's job easy. You know, you're reminding them of the points that you're trying to present, because it's quite a tiring job, being on an interview panel, and they've seen a lot of trainees that day and even that week. So you want to make it as easy for them as possible to score the points on their crib sheets.
One thing I wanted to say is that the interview actually was lovely, and everyone was very smiley and very
It's amazing.
nice.
I haven't really thought about
and I
lots
think I
of
was so
these
nervous
things before.
beforehand. I
Thank
think
you,
if I'd known
Olivia.
how, you know, they're all just lovely community paediatric consultants that are interviewing you, and they were actually very. It seemed very interested in what you've done and in finding out, you know, your strengths and what you've achieved. And so actually, it was a really friendly, pleasant interview, which is good to know.
I think that's really true, Siwan. They did their very best to put you at ease, didn't they? And also for us, we had to do a presentation, as you said, Siwan, and we were given the topic in advance, which was actually a real blessing, because you had the opportunity to, you know, really spend some time preparing a presentation and practicing it. And although I do get nervous presenting, I was advised to use it as an opportunity to calm myself down and relax into the interview. And I think it did that. I had confidence in my slides, I had confidence in what I was saying and what I wanted to get across through that short presentation. But yeah, it did enable me to kind of control my breathing and calm down and stop being quite so sort of flappy and worried. And yeah, then led quite nicely into the rest of the interview.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And having just done consultant interviews in the last year, I would say it is 100 million times less threatening and nicer than a consultant interview, because essentially, because your panel is, well, certainly when I did it, in each room there were 2 to 4 people interviewing me, whereas on a consultant interview you have many more than that.
Wow.
But yeah, I had
Siwan
a book
mentioned some
that
really good
I got
resources.
from
Did you
before I
or
applied
did
for
Lizzie or
paediatrics,
Emily
actually.
have any other
Medical
resources
Interviews, a
that could
comprehensive
help
guide to
you?
CT, ST and registrar interview skills, which, yeah, I just had on my bookshelf. So I reread some of that to help structure some answers, and yeah, it just gives you some tips on how to structure some questions.
So Lizzie gave a really good example of structuring your answers so that you made it easy for the sort of interview
I think it's
Was there
listening
any
to the
other ways that
question,
you could make
like
it
with
easy for
anything, like with exams,
the
it's
interviewers
always
to
about reading or listening to the
sort of,
question carefully,
do
so
to
that you
score points
don't
on the interview?
miss the point of what they're asking you, because it will be in there, but obviously your adrenaline's very high, you're very nervous, so it's easy to be thinking, oh, I need to talk about this particular case, and then you miss the point of what they're asking you. So yeah, so just listening, and there's no harm in asking them to repeat the question as well. If you're a bit flustered and you missed the point of it, ask them to repeat it, because that's important.
Yeah, great advice. So you mentioned some of the things some of the questions that came up.
Emily and
So
Siwan
you
can
said
correct me
that
if I'm out of
always a
date here, because it
safeguarding
was
type
about 5 years
question
ago when
come
I
up.
did my
Was
interview.
there
But
anything else that
in
came up
my
that you'd like
experience,
to
a
share with us?
topical question always comes up. So something about what's currently going on in the news and how that might be affecting services. So bearing in mind you're going for a grid post, so you're a senior trainee, so you're starting to think about being a consultant. So it's not just about patient management, it's about service management as well. So being aware of perhaps safeguarding cases that have been in the news recently, or cuts to services, or changes in service allocation, changes in budgets, those kind of things that perhaps as a more junior trainee you're not so tuned into.
I jotted down the kind of things that I was asked at my interview, and I thought they were quite fair questions, things that you probably would have thought about. But I was asked, what about community child health do you like best, and sort of why do you want to do community, or why do you think you would be good for community, and that sort of question. I was asked about my experience so far, so quite sort of open questions to allow you to just sort of talk about yourself. And then I was asked an example of something, or a case that had changed my practice, what I was most proud of in my career to date, and then a QI or a research or sort of management project that I'd been involved in. So yeah, quite fair questions. And I'd prepared all the sorts of things that Lizzie's mentioned, trying to keep up to date with what was in the news, and thinking about various other things. But yeah, that's what I had last year. Felt like it was 2 seconds. I can't really remember. I think the presentation was
Yeah,
about
they do
8
sound
minutes
quite
or 10
predictable,
minutes
which
in
is kind of
total, and
quite
then
nice to hear. And how
Yeah, I
long
think
did
the
the
whole
interview
thing
usually last for?
it was about 40 minutes in total, I think, about 20 minutes in each room. There was 2 rooms with 2 interviewers in each room. So yeah, and it was quite, and the sorry, I was going to say the neurodisability interview did have a clinical question in it as well, which I wasn't really expecting. I think I'd thought a lot about talking about my past experiences and why I wanted to do this specialty, and I hadn't really anticipated a clinical question. So that came a bit out of the blue, and I don't think I had a very structured way of answering it. I think I just blabbed all the different things that I would do. So thinking of maybe in advance, if I were to interview again, having a structured way that you would answer any clinical questions, probably a good idea as well.
Amazing. So yeah, I feel so much more prepared for grid applications now and the interview. Thank you all very much. Thank you for that advice, Siwan, Emily and Lizzie. So for the 2020 interviews, things are going to be a little different because of the COVID pandemic, and there are a few changes. So there'll be virtual interviews, and it's really important to stay up to date with the advice on the Royal College website. Join us again next week. Thank you for listening to Dragon Bites.